Much carried. So Nancy will give you plenty of history during the course of the video that we're about to show for you. But I wanted to give you a rundown of the basic facts about the World War II internment of Japanese Americans. In December of 1941, the Japanese Imperial Army, in an attempt to hamper the US Army's planned intervention in Southeast Asia, bombed Pearl Harbor, which was a military base in Hawaii. The US immediately denounced the Japanese and amid suspicion of cooperation in an existing environment of racial prejudice in the United States that targeted Asian Americans, signed Executive Order 9066 in February of 1942. This allowed the US government to forcibly remove people or communities without trial, and this set the stage for the Japanese American internment. It should be noted here that there has never been any evidence that suggested Japanese American cooperation with the Japanese Imperial Army. Executive Order 9102 followed in March, which established the War Relocation Authority and was set with the task of removing and resettling Japanese communities across Washington, California, and Arizona. The War Relocation Authority also set up temporary assembly centers and more permanent war relocation centers, what we would now call today detention centers and concentration camps, where Japanese Americans would be sent to live. They were given just days to pack what belongings they could take care with them, and many had no idea where they were being sent. Economists speculate that more than $1 billion in property and assets were lost during this forced evacuation. In the end, over 120,000 Japanese Americans were relocated and incarcerated, and there were 10 camps that were located in California, Colorado, Arizona, Arkansas, Idaho, Utah, and Wyoming. They started in 1942 and they finally closed in 1946. And this brings us to our special guest today, Nancy. Nancy Kikuko Adams was born in 1943 at Heart Mountain Relocation Center. She is the second oldest of 6 siblings, with her older brother, mother, and father already leaving the camp when she was born. And her family was based in Culver City, just outside of Los Angeles before their internment. Nancy went to a Catholic school just outside of LA and attended Cal State Long Beach for her bachelor's degree and worked for a nonprofit called World University Services. Nancy currently lives in Arizona with her husband, Tom, and they have raised 5 children and have 13 grandkids and 5 grandkids together. And to start, we're going to show you a video about half an hour long of Nancy giving a talk about her parents' internment, which gives a timely and informative account of what life was like at Heart Mountain. And after that, I'm going to ask her a few questions about her life there, and then we can open up the questions to the audience as well. And if you'd like to use the hand raising function or just put your questions in the chat, we'll try to get to as many folks as possible. So let's start this video here. All right.
Let's hope he's spelling my name wrong.
There's a big message in the middle about this is being recorded. It's blocking a third of the screen.
Oh, there it goes. Okay, it's good.
Good.
Like you, my 2 maternal uncles served in World War II, and both of them were in the Army. And before I start with how they participated in World War II, I'd like to start my family's history with my maternal grandfather. He was allowed to immigrate as a young man from Japan by joining the U.S. Navy. At that time, there was a window of time where Asians were allowed to do this. And when he joined the Navy, he was assigned as a cabin boy, attendant in the mess. And anyway, he wound up being Admiral Dewey's cabin boy. And so he participated with Dewey in the Spanish-American War, 1898, and was in the Battle of Manila Bay. Several years ago, we were able to go to the Philippines, and it was just really very special for me. I got to visit the island of Corregidor, and from there, you could look over and see Manila Bay. And I thought it just just everything came to me about, the American naval ships going in. And of course, I had my husband telling me everything that was going on. And they, came in. But anyway, it was just very special and kind of emotional for me to think, gosh, this is where our family got our start. Because of my grandfather's service in the Navy, he was able to become a naturalized citizen. And there was only like a short window of time that this was allowed. And he wanted to stay permanently in the United States. Meanwhile, my grandmother became a picture bride. And they really did things like that. And somehow there were these people that contacted my grandfather, sent my grandmother's picture to him. And so he proposed based on that. So she immigrated as well from Japan. After they married, they settled in California and they raised 7 children. My mother, my uncles, and my aunts all attended American public schools like all of us. They went to school to learn all about American history, about American ideals, and they pledged the flag every single day like we just did this morning. They didn't know anything else. They were, in all of the way they saw themselves, they were Americans. And so consequently, when my uncle was drafted, one of my uncles was drafted in September of 1941 into the Army. And he was assigned to a West Coast base, not too far from home. And that's what was going on. The rest of the family members were younger and they stayed on the farm. My grandparents were farmers. And my mother, after she went to business school, met and married my father. I come to my father's story. My father was 21 years old and he wanted to immigrate as well. He came from a very poor farming village in the very southern part of Japan. It's like a hop, skip, jump over the sea there, and you're in Okinawa. But that's how far south he was in Japan growing up. And he always had this wanderlust, feeling, and he didn't have any English knowledge, as far as speaking and writing, but he was able to obtain a job as a schoolboy. Many young men, usually, single, his age, would get a hold of people in the United States who would hire these young men as servants. So my dad took that job. Basically, it was like having a sponsor. He just couldn't come into the country without knowing anybody. So he was sponsored by this American family, and he worked for room and board while, he went to school as well. He wanted to learn English. And so he stayed with his family for a few years to learn English, to learn to read and write English. Meanwhile, he had met my mother and they got married and settled in the Los Angeles area. So now we come up to December 7th, 1941. My parents, meanwhile, they had my brother. I have an older brother, and my brother was 10 at the time. And they were out for a Sunday drive, but they said they like to do every Sunday. And they had the radio on, and they got the news that the Japanese had bombed Pearl Harbor. They were shocked and devastated. They didn't know what was going on. They were very, very surprised, as was the rest of our country. So they had little idea of what that was going to set up, but it set up a whole many things happening in their lives personally. My dad, when he was in Los Angeles, had a nursery business. He sowed plants and shrubbery, as well as was a landscape architect. So if anybody wanted to have their yards landscaped, they would hire my dad. And so he had a pretty good sized crew. He was hiring people to do the work. They go out and put in these beautiful gardens and landscaping. And he provided not only jobs for these other people, but they stayed. My brother said he remembers all of the employees stayed there on the property with my parents. And anyway, they had, the typical home, everything that goes with a home and a business. My dad relied on trucks to do, all of his work. Well, as soon as Pearl Harbor happened, all of a sudden they went to the bank and found out all their assets were frozen. They could not do they couldn't get their money out. They couldn't do any business at the bank. And I remember growing up, my mother saying, when she went into the bank or trying to go do some banking or other shopping, she was just treated very, very poorly by just the average person on the street. They came up to her, screaming at her, calling her names, spitting on her. And my mother never recovered from that. She really did, because she shared with me that, all she knew was being an American and that everybody has rights that are governed by our Constitution, and then to be treated like this just by strangers, and even people that knew them, all of a sudden they wouldn't do business with them. Then the people started coming in and, just trying to just rob them of their personal property. I mean, the property on my parents' land, and knowing that they weren't going to be able to do anything about it. So it was a bad time right after those first few months after Pearl Harbor. My parents were home one day, and a couple agents came. They identified themselves as representing the FBI. And, we're fully aware that I'm sure not all FBI agents were told to treat the Japanese Americans like this, but these two individuals happened to be just, not very positive with my family. And they started just rummaging in my parents' home. They were looking, they said, for anything that could be construed as espionage items. They said, well, the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor, and you must be possibly can be spies. And my brother was really into cameras at the time. He to this day, he still loves taking pictures. But anyway, he had two little Brownie Hawkeye cameras. I don't know if you all remember those little things, but anyway, they happened to be in his room, and they just took those. They just said, oh, you might go and take pictures and send them somewhere, and he says, honestly, from Los Angeles to the port of San Pedro was like 20 miles by car. So, and he goes, and all I had was my bike. There's no way I was gonna, go over to the Long Beach, San Pedro, the big naval area near Los Angeles. And, he was just, couldn't believe that somebody was just taking his camera. He also was a typical little boy. He loved to play with these little toy pistols, and he said they took that from him because they said, oh, you might, use that somewhere. So he said there were his pistols. And so as a young boy, he was traumatized. Then they were notified that by the FBI that they had 2 days to start packing up. And what had happened is they had these notices being posted all throughout the area. And on this side, it just was instructions to all persons of Japanese ancestry. So it really didn't matter. I'll be passing this around. It didn't matter that if they didn't distinguish between American-born and Japanese aliens. My father was an alien, mainly because he was not allowed to apply for citizenship. He had to always register as an alien. I have this card here, but a lot of this comes to my mind thinking, well, that's not that difficult to do, is to have alien registration taken. Anyway, he had to register every year, periodically show up to an office, probably a civil defense area, register by himself, saying he's still working, living at this given address. And so because my father was an alien, he accepted the relocation. He just figured, I am a visitor from Japan. I'm not an American citizen. However, my mother and my brother and the rest of the family that were American born, he couldn't understand that either because, as I said, he attended an American high school and learned all about American government and American ideals. Every family representative was supposed to report and pick up a family tag. So my family's number was 18565A. So all these tags, so you told them how many members in your family, and then these tags, they said, make sure you attach them to the front of your jacket, coat, and then put them on your bags. They were allowed to take whatever they could carry. So basically it was 2 suitcases. They didn't have nice big duffel bags like, my kids today travel. They have these big old duffel bags, but on wheels. They had just the traditional suitcases. And so they were instructed to pack bedding and like eating utensils and personal items, clothing, and then, your hygiene items. And that was it. They could not bring any other extra things because they couldn't pack them. And then, as I said, these tags had to be attached to their suitcases and then to their personal, to themselves. And so they had no idea. They weren't told where they were going to be taken. They were picked up by like a military type truck, my mother said, and taken not too far from Los Angeles. I don't know if any of you are familiar with the Pomona Fairgrounds. It's a little bit southeast of Los Angeles. What the government did, they took over about 15 facilities that were either racetracks or fairgrounds, and they just converted them literally overnight to make them housing for all the people that were being rounded up. So that notice that I just passed around said anybody of Japanese ancestry, if you had just a drop of Japanese blood in you, didn't matter how much or how little, but anyway, you had to report. And so they all these people, there were about 120,000 people from California all the way up into Oregon, Washington, parts of Arizona, coming into the western part of Arizona, had to be picked up and taken to they called it an assembly center. So my parents wound up in Pomona. They had to stay in a converted horse stall. The stalls were just barely being cleaned. They weren't even really cleaned. All they did is basically, tried to empty them of the animal. Well, they did empty them of the animals, but then they just laid flooring down on top of whatever was there. So it was not a very nice place, to be living. And then all of their materials suitcases were dropped off, and then they, had to stay there. They had no idea where, how, what was going to happen after that. In mind, there is word already coming over from what Hitler is doing to the Jewish people. There were already these rumors, this reported information that Hitler was, destroying a lot of the Jewish population in camps. So a lot of this, rumors were going around at this assembly center about what was going to happen to them, to my parents, as well as all the other people that were there. They then were informed that, actually this notice gives the notice of going into the assembly center. But then from here, they were told that they were going to go to one of the 10 relocation camps in the United States. And so my parents were sent from the Los Angeles area up into Wyoming. and there was a camp that was just barely being finished by August of 1942, as they were taken by train from the Los Angeles area and taken all the way north. And they, again, had no clue as to what they were going to have, where they were going to have to live, or what was going to happen to them. When they arrived, the camp was still literally being built. Years ago, I was traveling as a college student, and I was on campus back east, and this man asked me, he said, "You look like you're about the age that you were born in one of the Japanese American relocation camps." And I was just like shocked. I didn't wear a sign or anything. And I said, "How did you guess?" He goes, "Well, he worked for the War Authority at that time during World War II, building these camps." So he asked me where I was born, and I told him in Wyoming. He goes, "I was on that camp." So it was really interesting to hear him share from the government side what they were doing. They were literally just breaking ground, so to speak, and they took the Japanese Americans into areas that were not very populated. They wanted them, number one, away from the coast, thinking that, that'd be good for espionage reasons, as well as there was a safety issue too. Honestly, the average Americans were not treating the Japanese very well, Japanese Americans. So it was a safety thing too. So all these families would be moved further inland or eastward. So anyway, but I'll pass around this map. This shows the different camps. There were 10. The most eastern one was in Arkansas. Where Rohr.
We're in Arkansas.
Rohr, R-O-H-W-R. They took a train load, and the people there, the governor of Arkansas told the president, FDR, "No, you're not going to bring a train load of Japanese Americans." And the president basically told him, "It's not your choice." He told him, he told him, "We need a facility built to house these families." And so it was quite an interesting time for the people there that lived there.
They built their own.
Mm-hmm. Well, they made sure the state of Arkansas had to just give up a huge area to house, so many thousand people. And like I said, it was not a real positive experience for the local people, as well as the people on the train, Yeah, it was just not a good thing. Here's a nice blow up, and you can see, since you're asking about this one, is a little closer picture of the camps. A few years ago, they were able to take a crew from Los Angeles, and this picture I have here is an actual building from the camp where I was born in Wyoming. It gives you an idea. They left it just like the way it is, not because they didn't have time to finish it. This is the way these buildings were when my parents arrived. They were covered on the outside with tar paper, and the flooring were hastily built. They were built on the plans of a military base. Just like any military, they just use that plan. So these buildings are just like what you would see probably at Davis Monthan or Fort Huachuca. It was, how they came up with it. And in one of the pictures, you'll see they also were able to bring down a guard tower. One of the things that really upset my mother was the guard towers, that there were guard towers spaced throughout the whole perimeter of the camp. And she said what bothered her is the military people that were up there armed were pointing their rifles in, not out. And, most of the people that went into camp, I would say the majority of them, maybe there might have been 1% who really fought it. Everybody there just said, we want to prove our loyalty. We don't want to, be negative about it. They just accepted it. They said there's nothing else we can do. So for my mother to have those rifles pointed in at them, it really was disturbing to her because she just felt like, we're not going to do anything. We're not going to fight or anything like that. My grandmother was widowed by this time. My grandfather had just passed away right before 1941. And so she was widowed, and my rest of my aunts and uncles that were still living with her, they were living in the northern part of California. They were sent to a assembly center first, and then from there, they then were sent to Arizona. So if you ever drive from here to California, you might go through Quartzsite, that area. Well, right past Quartzsite is a little place called Poston. And right in behind there, along the Colorado River, was the camp my grandmother and my aunts and uncles were sent. They just were arbitrarily sent to one of the 10 camps. My uncle, my mother's youngest brother, now he was still at home, but he wanted to prove his loyalty. So they were asking for volunteers to serve with an all Japanese American unit. What happened was in Hawaii, there was a core group of Hawaiian Americans who they were rounded up too. They were just told, you can't be serving. Well, from that group there and some of the officers, they decided that they wanted to serve together, and they created this all Nisei, which is second generation Japanese American battalion. So the 100th Battalion was formed, and basically with Hawaiians. But my uncle, who volunteered out of camp, wound up being attached to them. And they went to Camp Shelby in Mississippi for training. And then from there, they were sent to the European front, like all of you that went through the Battle of the Bulge. And this is a picture of my uncle that did the volunteering. He fought in I was just looking at the time frame because I was trying to get that in perspective for my own mind. He was up in the northern French area in the Vosges Mountains, in that part of France called Gruyères. And if you remember the story of the Texas Battalion, the Lost Battalions, my uncle was a part of that regimental combat team that freed the Lost Battalion. And so they shared, or he and his regimental team shared with many of you the same, that cold winter, where they just freezing weather in that area, because it wasn't in a mountainous area, pretty much like what you experienced in the Ardennes into the Battle of the Bulge. And so, and they fought very hard. They had high casualties out of his unit, and he was awarded the Purple Heart along with so many others. One of the things on the back of my uncle's picture, we found a postcard that it is written, as if you had time to be sending postcards home, but he had gone into a store apparently, and where they were had these cards. But this comes from the Vosges Mountains where he served in the European campaign. Now, the uncle that I told you about that was drafted, he had a little different story. He was serving or attached to a base on the West Coast, and he said as soon as Pearl Harbor was bombed, they rounded up all the Japanese Americans that were in the military, and they shipped them east. He went to Fort Sill. I mean, he said they didn't know what to do with them. He said they just shipped them there, not knowing, they didn't have an assignment. They were just supposed to get them off the coast. So he was there for a little while, and then he said they were told that all of you with any Japanese ancestry, you're going to go to foreign language school. So they were sent up into Fort Savage for the Japanese immersion, and they were to, really bone up on their Japanese language, reading and writing. After about a year of this training, some shorter than my uncle says he took longer, but anyway, he said then they were assigned to the Pacific War. So they were sent over to the Pacific, and pretty much like what we heard about the Arizona code talkers. My uncle, along with all those that were in the military intelligence service, they would, translate and interpret messages. They would be listening. And so they did a lot of work like that. It is my understanding that because of what they did for that part of the war on the Pacific, that shortened the war effort by 2 years, because they were able, the American, soldiers were able, our military was able to take care of, whatever the Japanese were sending over on their radios. So anyway, that uncle, he served post-war Japan and Korea, and he was very, very proud of his service, but never. I mean, I had to really, really pull information on him. I said, tell me, because that generation just didn't want to talk too much about what happened. They just didn't want to. I mean, he never. I'd see him all the time, but he never would tell me about his military experience or anything. So I had to physically sit with him and say, please tell me what happened, how you got into the military, and your experience and all that. And quite ironically, my grandmother, his mother, had relatives still living in Hiroshima after the bombing. He was able to go visit what relatives were left. And he did tell me, we have distant relatives that were in the bombing. But when he was in the Army, and he said on his leave time, he made it a point to go connect with family that he had never met before. So he found that to be really a good time. And I'm glad he shared that with me, because my mother never told me that. I didn't know that, on her side of the family, we had family in Hiroshima. She never talked about that. I only heard that from my, like I said, my one uncle. And about the time when my uncle was serving over in France, in that campaign, was about a month before the Battle of Bulge. So just to give you a perspective of timing. So then when the Battle of the Bulge was just about completion is when the United States Supreme Court ruled it was unconstitutional to detain American citizens. They said, this is unconstitutional. So they started saying that the camps had to be closed. Well, it was a very interesting time for a lot of the people that were behind the barbed wire, because a lot of them did not want to leave. They got secure there. They didn't want to be going back. They didn't want to go back home to negative treatment. So a lot of them just didn't want to leave. They were just actually, I think it was probably a form of depression. They didn't have a life. They didn't want to have a life to go back to. But I'm very proud of my father, because he was one of those types of men that just wanted to just get back, back to life and get on with his life. So he, and my mother, well, he left first. He had known some people that wound up in the Denver, Colorado area. Those friends of his that had moved. See, some people were allowed to voluntarily move out of California. And so this was a group of people that he knew and had stayed in touch with. So he was able to go up into Denver and with their help relocate there. And I didn't mention that my mother was pregnant during this time of the camp, and she was that bothered her too. She told me she didn't know what kind of doctors were going to be available. Was there going to be a hospital where she would deliver her baby and all of that? Fortunately, they had camp hospitals. They were inside the camp. They had first aid stations, so they did get good care in these hospitals. And so this is my identification. See what a cute little baby I was. But each person that was in the camp were given these ID cards. And it's the reason I have that is my mother just feels so badly that I didn't have the traditional baby pictures taken. It's like I have a mug shot, you know. So that's my identification card that I was allowed to leave the camp with my parents. My brother had his, and then my parents. And the reason my father went to Colorado was because California was still closed. The governor at that time said that Japanese Americans are not welcome back. And so they stayed in Colorado for a little while until that ban got lifted. And there was a really, really good friend of theirs, a Caucasian lady that got to know my parents in Los Angeles. She kept in touch with my parents during this whole time. And so when my father was able to return to the Los Angeles area, she helped my dad find new property. They had lost everything that they had before: house, cars, trucks, all his materials that he had. So she helped him relocate to a different area. And it's in this, what if any of you know that, South Bay area of California, Southern California. And my parents were able to return in about 1949, and then they rebuilt their business and started all over again. I was only just a baby during this whole time of the relocation, but you know, because I know my mother agonized so much over what had happened to her as an American citizen. I grew up just hearing about how it was for her emotionally. And she, you know, just was so afraid that if we went to war again with, you know, anybody, well, if Japan and the United States went to war again, this would happen all over again. She said, I don't think we've learned anything, but hopefully we have. I think we have come a long way. We've seen a lot of different campaigns, wars since that time. And as we said in our invocation, that hopefully we'll all learn from our experiences and that we will not have to, you know, go through this again. In 1955, my father was finally allowed to gain his naturalization. He was so excited. And so I just want to pass this around. Like I said, I'm very proud of him. He worked hard. He never was a bitter person. He just always, but that's kind of a lot of the Japanese way. They just accept things. They just accept life. This is, you know, there's nothing you can do about the changes, so we'll just go with the flow. And so he just worked really hard and, you know, rebuilt his business up again. He just, you know, did what he had to do. There was a long time there that he could not find work, but he was able to do that. And I found this among his things too. It was just really awesome to see that, because he was a saver, and I think I get that from him too, because I have all this stuff. But you know, like I said, I just want to, you know, share my family story and their memory, because I think all of us as Americans have seen a lot, and hopefully, you know, we'll go forward and not have to go through another World War. And I have, you know, like I said, my husband went through Vietnam. That was very traumatizing for us. And I have a son-in-law who served in Desert Storm. That was a whole nother thing. And, you know, I said, it's got to end, you know. And so, but you know, I am happy and proud of my family members that have served. My one brother that was alive during the camp experience, he enlisted right out of high school, and you know, he served post-war Germany and for his time in the army, and he was proud to serve in the army too. So again, I really appreciate the time, and I thought I'd leave some time if anybody wants to share anything or ask questions. Yeah.
All right. So that was the talk that Nancy so generously gave. And now we're going to move on to a couple questions as well. I thought I might start with maybe a couple, and then we can move it to the audience if they have questions of their own for Nancy, or if they have questions about the internment in general. I'm happy to provide a little historical context or any additional kind of information that people might be interested in. Nancy, I thought I might start by asking what types of work your mother, father, and family friends performed during their time in Heart Mountain, and what did they do to also pass time for leisure as well?
My father volunteered to be a carpenter. That was not in his background at all, but they needed a lot of help in building the barracks where all the families were put, were barely going up. So my father volunteered as a carpenter and to help get some of the barracks built so that more families would have, you know, better places to live. And my mother did not work during the encampment. Since I was a newborn, she was, I think, pretty much taking care of me as a baby, and she was real concerned. I think I mentioned that in my other talk, that she did not know, you know, what kind of medical facilities were going to be available with a newborn. So she was very concerned about that and wanted to make sure that I had all the type of upbringing that she thought I should have. So my older brother that I mentioned that was 10 at the time, he was a half brother. So I was really the firstborn from my mom. So this was a whole new experience, having a newborn baby and then being put into camp. So that was very concerning for her. And I at the time when I was growing up and I'd hear her concerns, I couldn't relate because, you know, I was young, teenager, but after, you know, I got married and had children, I could really relate to what her concerns would, you know, were during that time.
So that is actually a great kind of transition. Do you want to say a little bit about the living space that your parents occupied during their time in Heart Mountain, and what are some of the things that they did to kind of make it feel like home?
Well, they were, you know, as mentioned, they were just barracks built on the military plan. So they were very crude, and they, because it was in Wyoming, the winters were very harsh, very cold, and the flooring, they didn't have like real nice carpets or anything like that. So the cold air would come up through the wooden planks on the floor until, you know, some of the people could start making or getting material to put down on the flooring. It was very, very chilly and cold. And each family unit had a big kind of a stove, you know, to heat each unit. So they would, you know, rely on that. And then my mother would, you know, try to heat what food that they could. They did have to eat, you know, in mess halls, but sometimes, you know, they would bring food back to their apartment, and then these stoves would be helpful in heating up the food. There was, of course, no such thing as microwaves in those days. That would have been handy, but it was very difficult in terms of just, you know, all of a sudden being ripped from a regular home to living in a barrack with, like I said, the the cold air would come through the floorboards, and then the tar paper covering on the sides was really no protection for that kind of environment. Very, very cold.
Privacy.
Yeah, and then yeah, Tom just mentioned that there was no privacy. Let's say probably in my parents' case, they had to share with, 3 or 4 other families, and they were all just put into these barracks. So there was no privacy. So with the government gave out those what we call army blankets. They were pretty heavy, and they would use them, for bedding. But they found out that they could hang those up and give privacy between the families. So that was a good thing. So then I have to ask, what did they use for blankets? Because they weren't allowed to bring anything like that. They had very minimal items that they could bring along to the camp.
So my next question then is, have you been able to revisit Heart Mountain or do any of the annual pilgrimages to the former concentration camps organized by Japanese American communities?
I've not gone on a pilgrimage, but Tom and I made a trip up there. I wanted to see just what it was like, what the area would be like, just so I can kind of be in touch with what my parents went through. And very, of course, that was many, many years afterwards, but it was very stark. I could understand why my mother was so upset. I mean, there was nothing up there. They were just, put out in the middle of nowhere, and then having to live in those barracks. So it was a big transition or big adjustment, as you might think, since she grew up in, basically Southern California. So what really a far cry from what she was used to, living, how she was used to living.
Right. Yeah. I mean, to my knowledge, there are interpretive centers at Manzanar National Historic Site, which is in the Owens Valley in California. And then Minidoka also has an interpretive center and is also the site of some major renewable energy construction. That is a source of controversy if people want to check that out as well.
Right.
And my next question then, and it'll be my last one before we open it up to the floor if people are interested in asking Nancy more questions, is how willing were your parents and other elder Nisei and Issei members of the Japanese American community, how willing were they to talk about the internment? Did you feel like there was a certain taboo about the topic until like a later date?
They were traumatized. My mother, at least in my family's experience, my mother was just devastated. She really couldn't talk about it. And I knew, growing up, I knew not to push her on the subject. And the only real information I had was from my brother, who was 10 at the time. So he was able to share a little bit more about what they went through. And my father, being an immigrant, he just took a different take on the whole situation. It was like, okay, I guess this is how they treat, Americans. I mean, his whole experience was a little different from my mother. He had not grown up as an American citizen. He was a Japanese citizen. So I found that very interesting between the two of them, that he just kind of took the experiences. Oh, this is the way they treat people, which, now that I think back on it, that's pretty sad. That's really, really sad that if he thinks this is the way most Americans treat people.
I'm not sure about the guns pointing in. That bothered mommy.
Oh, yeah. Tom reminded me that, and I mentioned it in my talk, that when they were in the camp and the soldiers were up on those big, towers, and they had armed rifles, and these rifles were pointing in at them like they were going to escape, rather than, protecting from the outside. So that really was disturbing to her. She never had that kind of experience, growing up in California.
Right. Yeah. I mean, there was no universal consensus, and different families reacted differently to the internment. But there was a popular saying during this time from the Japanese American community was called shikata ganai, which means it can't be helped.
Right.
And it's kind of trying to make the best of a bad situation. And while others suffered in these concentration camps, like other people just tried to make the best of the situation. And especially there's like kind of a generational divide between, first generation Japanese Americans and, Nisei in terms of like how they responded to the
Right.
internment. So, yeah. So with that, I thought I might open up the floor to questions that the audience members might have for Nancy or myself, but mainly Nancy. And if you just want to unmute your mics and then shout them out, or if you want to put them in the chat and I can read them out and we can discuss them together, whatever people would like to do. But I'll give you guys a minute or two if you would like to start.
I was wondering, Nancy, if you could tell us about your experience in Catholic school with your penmanship.
Oh, yeah, that was really funny. Well, to back up a little bit, my mother never really told me why she put me into a Catholic school. It was just, I had gone to regular public school for first and second grade. Then all of a sudden, I was being sent to a Catholic school, and she never told me why, I was making this change in the school. But the only thing I could put together was that while they were in the camp, there were Marino fathers there that came in and did what they could to give support to the Niseis, going through that encampment experience. And I think, and again, she never really said, but I think because of the message that these Marino fathers were giving support, in all ways that they could, I'm assuming that's why she decided to put me in Catholic school. So when we were, practicing our penmanship, we always had penmanship as part of our daily routine. And the sisters that I had, the sister I had, the teacher, she wrote my name hyphenated, like the Irish with a O and then hyphen a capital H. So that's what I, went home and was practicing, my homework like that. And my father saw me, well, he always checked my homework, but anyway, he asked me why I was writing my name like that. And I said, well, that's the way the teacher had me write it. And then I said something very interesting. I said, I'm Irish, so that's the way the Irish have written it. So my father kind of like, I could just look in his face and I thought, oh, he wasn't really upset, but then I could tell he wanted to kind of straighten me out a little bit. So he told me I wasn't Irish. And I was like, oh, I'm not, it was just so funny. I had no clue. They never talked about the fact that we were, Asian or Japanese, and that I was Japanese American. He was, an immigrant or anything like that. But from that point on, I learned what my heritage was.
Yeah, and just for a little context too, the Japanese American Citizens League and a couple other civil rights organizations partnered with churches fairly often to help with relocation efforts for Japanese Americans after the internment. So there would be these kind of tentative plans to resettle them across the country in communities where they thought they might be more welcome than others in some cases. So they would help them out with housing, sometimes with jobs. And obviously there were vibrant Christian church communities within the camps themselves as well. At Heart Mountain and at Manzanar and Tule Lake, all across the country, there would be these parishes that would form that was run by internees and for internees. Does anybody else have a question? If not, I can keep going down my list, but I want to prioritize audience questions if at all possible. In that case, then, Nancy, I have another question for you. So you mentioned Catholic school. What are some of your other
Okay.
earliest memories after relocation? And what did your family do in Colorado before relocating back to the West Coast?
Well, as I mentioned in the talk, my father had some friends that he knew in the Denver area, and they invited my parents up, to relocate there since California was still closed. And it worked out. My father, actually, not my father, my mother, because my father was an alien, so he couldn't purchase anything. So my mother, in her name, they purchased a hotel there in Denver. And what it did, it gave them a source of income, by renting out the rooms. And then we lived in a couple of the rooms there in the hotel. So it was a really, I thought, really clever thing to do, where it gave us a place to live as well as a source of income, because there weren't too many people willing to hire people right out of the camps.
Right.
So that worked out.
Yeah, and it should be said too that there's a little bit of like a context and a history for Japanese Americans in particular in the hospitality management economy. Like, for example, my great grandfather on my father's side ran a hotel in Seattle before
Oh,
parents were interned at Minidoka in Idaho. So just a little kind of fun fact there as well. It was one of the
yeah.
few countries where they were like allowed to work without relative stigma, kind of like farmland as well, because they could own the businesses on their own. They didn't have to be beholden to like white business owners and like their ownership, and they could also assist other Japanese American community members and people that are kind of immigrating from Japan as well.
Right.
Any other questions, guys? If not, I'll just keep going down the list, like I said, but like I feel like there might be a question or two in this audience that would be for Nancy. All right, I got one in the chat.
Okay.
So I joined a little late, so I'm not sure if I missed this, but what was the story of how your parents were bought from California to the camp? So that was the Executive Order 9066 that we discussed. But if Nancy wants to just reiterate that fact too.
Right. Well, as Kai mentioned, the president signed Executive Order 9066, which meant anybody of Japanese background had to be removed from the West Coast, and so all the way from Washington, Oregon, and California, anybody of ancestry, even if you had a drop of Japanese blood in you, you had to go. And I've always think about that now that I have great grandchildren. I thought they would have to go into camp, and they have really no connection really to their Japanese heritage, but because they have Japanese blood in them, they would have to be removed. So like I said, my great grandchildren would have to be packed up and moved into a camp, and probably wouldn't even understand why they're being sent there.
Right. Yeah. So just to kind of give people like a sense, like if you imagine like a big map of the United States, Military Zone 1 was the entirety of like that West Coast, especially its furthermost kind of western coastal edges. And then Military Zone 2 was like the rest of the country, essentially. And they wanted to make sure that all of the Japanese Americans were evacuated out of Military Zone 1 because they suspected corroboration between the Japanese Imperial Army and Japanese Americans. And of course, like I said in my introduction, there was never any evidence that would corroborate that claim. And it was kind of founded upon these kind of racist kind of prejudices upon Japanese Americans. And it was also rooted in economic opportunism, because in the wake of Japanese Americans being forcibly evacuated from their homes, many families also, like people claimed their lands and they never had to pay for it or anything. And like I said, Japanese Americans lost north of like $1 million cumulatively with all of the property that was seized and never returned. There was another great comment that I saw, and it was from Patty, and said, "Kai, I have heard the term Japanese internment, but I've been told that the more accurate and preferred term is Japanese incarceration. Please comment." So this is a point of personal preference. I use the terms interchangeably, but generally the Japanese American Citizens League and people who are commemorating the incarceration of Japanese Americans generally feel like the language around the discourse of Japanese American history, especially as it regards to the incarceration during World War II, can often be sanitized by the American government in its remembrance. So, like I said, they were very the American government was extremely kind of sensitive of the term concentration camp in the wake of World War II, especially with conversation about the Jewish death camps and labor camps overseas in Europe, like Dachau and Auschwitz, and what they were doing to Jewish people there. So they made the very kind of intentional distinction to rename them the camps war relocation centers, which kind of has a more paternal, perhaps, and kinder ring than a concentration camp. But historians correctly point out that, especially in kind of the current discourse, that the assembly centers where they were first rounded up were detention centers. And we still see those today being used by ICE and other government bodies that are interested in immigration, especially after 9/11 in the establishment of the Department of Homeland Security. And then the camps where Japanese Americans were kept are concentration camps. And that language and that distinction is important to some people. And I think it's an important way to kind of frame the injustice of these camps.
And my mother always said, yeah, she didn't like the relocation term. She
Right.
said, "You were born in a concentration camp." She must have said that over and over again. It was so traumatizing to her. And she just thought, call it like what it really was, a concentration camp. So that's how, and I think as you point out, Hitler's doing what he did with the Jews was kind of so, current, at least for my mother's sake. That's how she would come up with that. It definitely was not relocation. It was concentration.
Right, right. Does anybody else have anything they'd like to include in the chat, or you're welcome to just shout it out and we can answer it as well? We got time for maybe a couple more before we wrap up tonight.
I do have a question. Did the government give your parents or other people money or supplies when they left the camps?
Not really. They were given, I forgot the minimum, I think $19 a month while they were in the camp. But basically they used that. There was like catalogs, like Montgomery Ward catalog. My mother would talk about that. If they wanted to order items, because they were not prepared for the really cold environment that they went into. So they needed those catalogs to order, boots, heavier coats or jackets, hats and that kind of item. So that's, I think, basically the money that they were receiving monthly from the government basically just went in to help survive in the camp itself.
Yeah, and I should say as well, so generally, there was absolutely minimal compensation given to these families on the other side of these camps. Usually what they do is they give you a bus ticket for you and your family, and they'd be essentially saying, you're on your own, you need to figure out what comes next. And whether you have that assistance or not, you need to be out of the camps. And I think it's also important to remember on that same note that people were reluctant to leave the camps, which is something that maybe sounds counterintuitive to some people. But you need to remember that they essentially were forced to uproot their lives, their previous lives before the camps, and move to this camp. And with some people, they were able to establish a new community and a new kind of sense of like connection among Japanese Americans that they didn't have before in some cases. And they were reluctant to leave for that reason, even if it meant living in these kind of torrid and horrible conditions. They didn't know where they could go next. So it was kind of a very kind of fraught issue for some people. And it's why the camps didn't close immediately in 1945. They actually went like, I think it was the summer of 1946 when the last camp resident left the concentration camps. So, I mean, and it was born out of the fact that people didn't really have a place to go in some cases. And I should say as well, there was a case of reparations that developed during the Asian American movement of the 1970s as well. So this is spearheaded by people like Yuri Kochiyama and other Japanese American activists that sought reparations for Japanese Americans' families in the wake of this kind of racial awakening of the Japanese American and Asian American movement. And in 1988, the Reagan administration signed a bill into law, which provided reparations of $20,000 to Japanese families. And some families took it, some families didn't, because frankly, it's a embarrassing amount of money to give given what many families lost, because it didn't reflect the value of what they lost or the emotional damage.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. And then, yeah, as you mentioned, there was a formal apology
Right.
given, and that apology meant more than, let's say, any monetary compensation, but to have that formal apology. And I've got that framed in one of our rooms. I just always like to remind myself that, and read it, you know, daily, to see that the government saw their wrong and gave a formal apology.
Was that $20,000 per family or per person in the family? Per family.
It was per family.
If you were alive.
Oh, yeah. And then in my parents' case, they were deceased. So they didn't receive any compensation. So I don't know how many parents or how many families lost parents that were not able to be compensated.
Right.
So Nancy, you weren't compensated because your parents had passed away? Is that correct?
I'm sorry, I didn't hear your question.
I said, so you were not compensated because your parents passed away. Is that
Yes.
correct?
No, because I was born in the camp, I was compensated. So, I went through some anxiety about, in one way, accepting it, the compensation. I was like acknowledging the government saying, you know, this is okay, we're going to compensate you. But at the same time, I wound up accepting it so that we had children that were ready to go to college. And that was education was a big thing with my parents. So I went ahead and accepted it, and we put it in a college fund for our children. So I was glad to have that reason to accept it.
Yeah, Nancy brings up a great point there. She wouldn't have been the only person that struggled with the decision whether or not to take the money in some cases, because in some cases, like my grandfather in particular, struggled with it because he felt like it was part of like his national duty as a citizen to just not accept the money. And again, just shikata kanai, it can't be helped, to kind of ignore the past and kind of move on and acknowledge it for what it was. And he felt that it would be almost a gesture of disloyalty to the American government. I'm not sure if I understand the logic on my end, but he thought it might be like a gesture of disloyalty if he took the money. And he wasn't the only Japanese American who felt that way. There were larger discussions in JACL chapters about whether or not the money should be taken. And the reparations was generally a legislative move that was supported by Japanese American activists, but there was some pushback from other, like perhaps older generations. And some people just didn't accept it out of principle because it was, like I said, a fairly paltry amount of money as well.
It must have been a tough decision.
Yes.
It was.
I understand.
was.
I understand.
Any other questions, folks? We can maybe do one.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes. Can you hear me? Mom, this is Tamiko. You said
Oh,
that,
Hey, Tomiko.
yeah.
you said mama always, she had that real problem with the name concentration camp as
Right.
opposed to relocation.
Right.
What if the government said relocation camp? Why were they using that name, relocation? To me, that means they're relocating you to like somewhere else. Like what, because did they have a plan, or did they tell the Japanese Americans, okay, that's like to me saying, okay, we're moving you here to keep you safe or for something better. But it was more,
Yeah.
like Mama said, it's more like a concentration camp. So I agree with her thought process.
Right. Well, the
Because you
government,
couldn't leave.
no. And we didn't have a choice. We were rounded
Right.
up. Or
Right.
rounded
Up.
up. So
With the guns pointed
Yeah.
at her. So
Yeah.
what, did they ever tell you why the relocation camp was used? Why did they call it that?
oh, it was supposed to be for our protection. The
Oh, Air
the
quote-
Nisei family protection from everybody else. But
oh,
that's
did you
what
feel threatened by anybody else?
well, that's what she said. My mom, but
Yeah.
there was really no fear, but she just saw it as a way to be safe, because there were people who were very negative,
Beat up.
course.
yeah. So I think in the long run, it was a good decision to be relocated, as you're saying,
Right,
just for safety reasons, because
right.
people
Well, yeah, people are crazy.
exactly.
But the guns didn't have to be pointed in. They should have been pointing out, protecting you.
Yeah, but that's
Keep
not
it-
the way.
yeah.
That
Yeah, so
wasn't the
now
way
I
it went.
agree with, now that you say that, I agree with what you're saying about Mama having that issue, because, if it's supposed to be for protection, they should be, protecting you, having the guns look out and shooting at people.
That's
on that.
right.
So, okay, well, she was right then.
Yeah,
I can see her point then. Yeah, I'd be a little upset too,
yeah, a tad, right? Yeah,
just a wee bit. So now,
yeah,
by you doing this and telling, the real story, and like about real people, and about how, mothers and parents felt, did, and you said Papa always did extra work to earn like more money and stuff in the camps to earn extra money. What did he do? Was he doing carpenter stuff, you said?
yes, he was, yeah, doing work like that. And he would go get permission to leave the camp and work out in the fields, like people raising vegetables, because it was war was going on. There was a
Right.
lot of people that there weren't enough people to work, the fields for, raising crops and whatnot. So he was ambitious. He went outside the
Oh,
camp and
no, yeah,
worked like that.
to
Right.
say the least,
Right.
say the least. Yeah, so, oh, wow, this is very good talk. I'm glad you guys set this up.
Yeah. Thank you, Kai. She's our oldest
Thank
daughter,
you.
by the way.
Wonderful.
Yeah.
I should say too that, well, those guns were also used a couple times on Japanese Americans as well.
Yep.
It wasn't just kind of like them kind of threatening them when they were, when they had the desire to leave to make sure they stayed in. Like there were Japanese Americans that were killed by those barbed wire, towers with guards in them.
Really?
There was we would call it now like a racially motivated killing from a guard in Manzanar, and there was another one in Tule Lake, I believe. So those are both the concentration camps in California. My grandmother was at Tule Lake as well. And I should say as well, it's important to remember that these camps weren't like a monolith as well. each one has its own set of like politics and administration and bureaucracy. Some were more strict than others with the way that they enforced those policies that were handed down by the War Relocation Authority as well. And I should say as well that Tule Lake was considered the most punitive camp out of all of the 10 concentration camps in the United States. So they sent the most kind of radical dissenters, like the Japanese who were still loyal to the Imperial Japan were sent there. People that were seen as like community organizers and rabble rousers would also be sent to Tule Lake as well. And indeed, there were some people that were killed at these camps when they tried to protest, or there was kind of like a misinterpretation of like an action of a citizen that was imprisoned there, and someone pulled the trigger. And of course, nothing came of it. You know, the guards thought they were just doing their job. So there wasn't any kind of corrective action taken because it was a concentration camp, you know?
If I might, there was a dichotomy of things too. Like in Tule, they beat up the no-no boys pretty bad, and they were racially against the no-no boys. In Heart Mountain, it was so hot during the summers, the population asked the commander if they could have a swimming pool. And he wrote a request to the government that they build a swimming pool, and the government turned him down. And then the commander, a month later, sent a second letter asking for a reserve of water because of the drought. And the government approved the water reserve, which they turned into a swimming pool so the people could, enjoy it. And Nancy's brother enjoyed that swimming pool, but it worked both ways. And like life, there's good and bad on both sides. So
Yeah. Well, didn't Tado, Mom, your older brother, get in trouble because he had the cameras? Like, and he liked doing the pictures?
Well, they were confiscated. Yeah. I mean, he was the one, he was the victim,
Yeah.
So,
Well, I thought he got in trouble just because he had his little camera.
No, they just took it. But they confiscated it, and that really upset them. Yeah.
Well, yeah. I remember him always saying that, or there was always, that kind of like that was a negative feeling that he'll carry on for his life.
Right.
I wasn't sure if he got like thrown in the cooler or something.
no.
He was only 10. He was only 10 years old. So,
well, some of those 10-year-olds,
yeah.
Said that the cameras in the executive order and by the directives handed down by the War Relocation Authority were specifically cited as a weapon of war. Like they were really, really serious about that, because they understood that the visual power of the camera had the ability to depict the reality of these camps and how they were, how people were being treated there. So what the Relocation Authority did was they hired a section of photographers. They were mostly photojournalists called the War Relocation Authority Photographic Section. And they were government photographers that were meant to take photos of the camps that were supposed to reflect favorably upon the government's decision to imprison these people. And they were often done in ways that kind of sanitize the living conditions. They often showed, children with like happy faces and latrines and the lack of privacy and the poor health care and the lack of schooling and like the kind of injustices that were going on in the camps. So like, photographers like Ansel Adams, who was a very famous photographer of the American West. A photo essay series called Born Free and Equal that people always see, and that completely misrepresents the experience, even though some of it is some beautiful portraiture. But yeah, cameras played a very particular and important role. And there were some cases too of Japanese Americans like Toyo Miyatake, who was imprisoned at Manzanar. He bungled in a camera and hid it in his lunchbox and used it around the camps. And I should say as well that the cameras were only banned up until a certain points. And at each of the 10 concentration camps, there were generally points where these rules kind of liberalized a little bit. And people were allowed to start using them. But in the first year, generally, they were not allowed to be used at all.
Right, right.
Huh.
Anything else? I don't want to cut anybody off here, but we are getting a little late on this side on the East Coast. Anybody else have anything else they want to add before we end tonight? I just want to thank you all for the wonderful discussion regardless. This is exactly what I wanted, like a nice kind of small, tight-knit group that we can all kind of have a conversation together about this stuff. So, of
Well, I
This
really
was great.
appreciate you doing this, Kai. It was really great.
course, no, thank you. And thank Carrie as well for
Yeah.
helping.
Yes, and Carrie, yes, we appreciate it.
Oh, thank you, Nancy. Thank you for sharing your story with all of us.
Oh, you're more than welcome.
Thank
you. Thank you.
Oh.
And
I
thank you,
just
Kai.
had one quick question. I think Nancy had said that the healthcare was good at the camp. Was that correct?
It was what, I'm sorry.
I thought,
What about-
I thought she had said that the healthcare was good at the camps.
Well, as far as I know, my mother never complained about it. So I kind of perceived it more like a first aid station, you know. But the fact that I was born safely there, I think was a good thing, you know, for her, because she was really concerned
Do you-
about, delivering me.
Do you know who the providers were? Were they US military? Were they civilians, or were they US Public
Some were
Health
con-
Service?
Japanese.
Who were they?
It was a combination of both. So some folks from the military, some folks were local to the areas where the concentration camps were enlisted and provided care to the camps as well. And it should be noted that generally they were okay about infant and beginning of life care. That was something that they really focused on because it was important to the optics of the camp that people could continue to have families in there. But generally, what the camps were kind of more infamous for was the often startlingly bad level of geriatric care for senior citizens and Japanese Americans that were approaching their 60s, 70s, 80s that were interned. And obviously the mortality rate among the population climbed steeply once they were in these camps, because they just didn't have the adequate health care that you need at the end of your life or as you get on in age.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for tonight. This was excellent. Thank you.
Thank you all for coming, and thank you, Kai, for moderating. You added
Yeah.
so much to the history and the discussion. I really appreciate
And it
it.
was nice meeting everybody again. Yeah, that was great.
Thanks again, Kai and Carrie. It was really nice.
Thank
So,
you.
thank you.
Good night,
Thank you.
everyone.
Nice.
Have a
Thank
great
you.